Ahoy! It's your buddy Hambone here, and I'm back again with a brand new coupon code from our friends over at Noble Night Games. This month, the code is Arcana, and it's a long one. It's running from now all the way through September 14th, and it's good for 10% off orders of $10 or more, online or in person. Arcana is the code. And let's face it, everybody, it's summertime. It's fun time. It's time to get back together with your friends and family, maybe do some grilling and chilling and ripping some board games or tabletop RPGs. And for all your tabletop RPGs, board games, dice, and Magic the Gathering needs, look no further than Noble Night Games. Noble Night also has a killer trading program, so if you need to free up a little space on your shelf and add a little cash to your wallet so you can buy more games, Noble Night is where it's at. And there's more details on that on their website. In the meantime, the code is Arcana, good from now all the way through September 14th from our friends over at Noble Night Games.
This is the Vintage RPG Podcast, your source for the best in classic and contemporary RPGs. With your hosts, Hambone and Stu.
Welcome to the Vintage RPG Podcast, coming at you again from the clubhouse, hidden somewhere in the swamps of New Jersey. I'm John Hambone McGuire, and with me, as always, is the founder and publisher of Unwinnable. When he said today we're going to talk about Witchcraft, I thought he was talking about the Hocus Pocus 2 trailer that just dropped. Stu Horvath.
Is that a thing that actually happened?
It literally just happened like an hour ago. Bloody Disgusting put it up, and I don't know how I feel about it because, like, dear listener, I really do regard the film Hocus Pocus as one of like my high holy Halloween movies, but they're making another one. It's going to be on Disney Plus. We'll see how it goes. But anyway, we're not talking about Hocus Pocus today. What are we talking about, Stu?
Okay, so we're going a little bit off topic. So if you recall, like a year, 2 years ago, I don't know.
What is time, Stu?
Time is a mystery that is meaningless. We talked to Peter Biebergall, the editor of Appendix N. Appendix N is put out by a cool little English publishing company called Strange Attractor Press. And they're great. Their entire catalog of books, even the ones that I'm like obviously not interested in, they all have like a vibe of cool. One of their taglines is publishing books on unpopular culture. So there's stuff on high weirdness and lots of occult things. I bought a whole bunch of books from them that are sort of trail guides to the lost rivers of London.
Wow.
Yeah, like just cool, really niche. There's not a lot of call for that in London, I imagine, and certainly outside of London. I don't think that it's a huge seller, but it got me. I think that they're super cool.
Well, Stu, in the end of the day, we're tourists. So we are like the target audience.
And if it's spooky or weird, like I'm really there. So as I said, they do a lot of occult themed stuff. They have a guide to Crowley's London, like the spots that he frequented in London that just came out, City of the Beast, which I'm excited to read as well. But when I put my most recent order in, I picked one book on a lark. It's called Of Shadows. And the subtitle is 100 Objects from the Museum of Witchcraft and Magic. And I was like, sure. I thought it was going to be a cool book because they all seem to be pretty cool books, but right out of the box, I was just like, this book is amazing. I love this book. This book is just like, it speaks to me on that level that like it instantly became like an all-time favorite books of occulty things, but also just generally, I love this book. And we're talking about it today because I feel like it has a lot of utility for role-playing games. It makes me want to run games, which is basically my requirement for wanting to talk about anything on this show and on the Instagram feed. So it matched that requirement. And of course, this really speaks to that whole idea that everything is a source book, right? That you can pull details from any book, from any source, and implement it in a role-playing game, because that's what role-playing games are about. It's about finding cool stuff and making pretend out of them.
You know it.
Yeah. This book is exactly what it says it is. It is photographs of 100 objects from the Museum of Witchcraft and Magic. It's in Cornwall. It was founded in the 50s by Cecil Williamson, who's since passed on. He sort of co-founded it with Gerald Gardner, who is the founder of, or one of the founders of Wicca. That was like a bad business deal, which I find stuff like that fascinating, because you would think that, like, I don't know, New Age mysticism would be a little bit more insulated from bad business deals, since it's sort of about good vibes, but no, apparently not. It's interesting. Williamson has like sort of a difficult time setting up. He's deeply interested in the subject matter and is collecting the stuff, but he has a hard time kind of finding a home for the museum because Christian folks kind of took exception to it in the 50s and 60s.
You don't say.
Yeah. They probably take exception to it now, too. But he wound up in Cornwall, which is an interestingly superstitious part of England. Like the folklore of Cornwall, I feel, is just very much still alive with the people of Cornwall, at least in my outsider's perspective of it. It's been there for a long time. There was a second owner whose name escapes me. And then the writer of the book, Simon Costin, is the current caretaker of the museum. The photographs, which are beautiful, are by Sara Hannant, who's done photographic studies of other sort of mystical and folklore subject matter. In this case, she selected objects from the museum that just kind of spoke to her, that interested her. They're all shot at night with black backgrounds, like deep shadows. They're sort of the opposite of like when I do miniature photographs on the Instagram feed where I shoot them on white. I get like I want to record as much detail as possible. She's much more recording like the feel of the object. They're not like documentary photos. Like there's definitely like a heavy vibe coming out of these photos, and they're rich and mysterious. And the thing that's interesting is it like immediately started to recontextualize how I think about witchcraft and the occult, because like I don't see the objects of use, the tools of the trade often. We have perceptions of these things. The Dungeon Master's Guide, for instance, 5th edition, one of my favorite things about it is all the pictures of the different wands. But those don't actually line up with stuff. It's fantasy. It doesn't have to. There's no requirement to it, but they don't line up with the real world analogies.
Right. I mean, all we know on the surface is that if mom sees a pentagram, it's going to be a real awkward conversation at dinner.
Yeah. And seeing the objects that were used, like one of the pieces in the book is a selection of wands from the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, which William Butler Yeats belonged to. And just seeing them, they're just so not what I expected. And they carry with them like a mystique that is interesting and recontextualizes sort of how I think about magic wands. The idea of like a staff, Gandalf has a staff, we had like, it's a piece of like wood that's polished from use. You use it to support yourself, but you also channel magical energies through it. And like, that's something that is in occult traditions, but they call it a blasting rod.
Really?
Yeah. And like, it's a really evocative name. And like, you want the blasting rod to be like in the real world, the thing that you point at something and it like blows down a wall, because that's how we think about it in D&D, but it's really more of a metaphor in the occult sciences. But still putting that name to a real world object, like it just rewires like the way my neurons fire in my brain,
Yeah. I mean, when you think about it, the concept of it, tying into the name, what is a wand supposed to do? It's supposed to channel energy and intention.
Yeah. You point with it, right? Like
right.
That's what it's doing.
And it is the conduit through which it's supposed to pass. So I think that blasting rod actually is a little more apropos.
And there's just so many cool things. There's like statues and chalices and daggers, human skulls and animal skulls and weird mummified cats. There's just like there's this whole undercurrent of stuff that was sort of found like wedged in chimneys or in walls of cottages across England for various talismanic reasons, like to encourage fertility or ward off evil spirits or whatever. It's always the same sort of protective magic, but like it's just this idea that like you can own a house in England that's been there for 400 years, take down a wall and find like some weird like fetish of a dead animal or a bird wrapped up in like bandages or something, like in red string, like super creepy folk horror kind of setup. But like that's sort of a thing that actually happens. And we don't think of magic in that kind of, especially in the context of D&D, in that kind of way, like it doesn't get applied that way. It's always something that a mage uses to shoot monsters with, right?
Yeah. And I mean, it's so far removed from the practical applications. Like when you get from A to B with, what you're finding in these books and how it's applied in Dungeons and Dragons, you're like, all right, or Tolkien or whatever it may be, Willow.
Mm-hmm.
I just watched Willow the other day for the first time in a bunch of years. It was on the Disney Plus, and that was interesting. But, I think it's cool. And I think there is like, a richness to finding this weird shit when you're remodeling your house. Like, you know, when you're talking about stuff like that, like I'm going to make a quick little sidebar here. You know, God, it was like 2012, 2013, probably 2013. My brother, my father and I, we went to Ireland, England, Scotland, and Wales. And, you know, as we're touring, we're going to see old castles. We're going to see like these museums and all this other stuff. And, you know, you think to yourself, the concept of like a lot of these things have been here forever, right? But then you're not really thinking so far as like, well, there's a lot of stuff that was built in like the 60s. And now, you know, people are buying these properties and they have modern sensibilities, obviously, because they don't want to live in an apartment building that the BBC and any of their TV series would made you to have believed that poor people live there.
Yeah.
You know? And so they're gonna jazz the place up. And like this is like a generation of people who will probably make these adjustments, find this weird shit in the wall, but then that's it. Then like it's gonna be like, you know, when you look at, you know, older books that don't have like a heavy print run and they become more valuable in a way because there's a finite number of them. Whereas like with these houses, like once they break through most of these houses, like all that like old weird magic shit is going to be gone. I mean, granted, it also may be cursed, so it may never leave the premises, but you know, there is a very real rarity to these kind of things and these experiences. So cherish them, folks, and call the exorcist when you need one.
There's also just the idea that practical magic in Dungeons and Dragons particularly is those are the spells that exists. They're there, like create food and water, but those are also the spells that like you're not going to take because it's a combat game. So
yeah,
and they're often the most interesting, and this sort of does the same thing with the magic items. It recontextualizes magic items are your special abilities in D&D, but these are magic items for like daily life, like things that are just going to help you get through your day, deal with your enemies, protect you from harm, and help you provide for your family. And it's just, I know that that's sort of like the idea of these older folk traditions. That's always been the idea, but I've just never really thought of, there's something about this book that made me kind of line that up with D&D for the first time and just see how interesting and different those things are and want to kind of like smush them together more. Like I want to see a magic shop in D&D that kind of functions like this. And I want to pull D&D into this direction where like you're finding like, and this kind of goes to like the Fungi from the Far Realms book, where it's just like I want these different sort of experiences where you can kind of like build and sort of inhabit the world differently than D&D allows you to do. But I still want to do it with D&D. D&D it's hard to escape D&D, and I know that folks are just like, oh yeah, Stu doesn't like D&D. It's like, no, I actually really love D&D. I just don't know how to squeeze different experiences out of it.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very specific kind of roller coaster.
Yeah,
you know, to speak to what you are saying, real Reader's Digest version, you know, the side eye that people get when they pick like purified water at the table, because you know, like there's no DM out there that's ever going to tee them up. Be like, you know what? Of all the spells that you could have picked for this combat game, you chose purify water, and I'm going to find a way to make this work for you. I don't think maybe more than once, someone who had picked purify water actually was able to use it in an effective way in game where it like saved the party's ass. So yeah, I think you're very much right. I think there is a certain degree of this is the game. And as much as you might want to add a little more color to that palette, it has a very, very specific look to it.
Yeah.
And it's hard to break free of that. I also think that a lot of things that we take for granted in these games is that, you know, like potions, for instance, you know, when you have people who are practicing witchcraft and other types of artistry that was very much left of center, especially in like the puritanical ages, like they're just making cough syrup, man. Like,
I mean, you know, that's true. Like that's the whole idea of like the cunning folk. They were interested in the application of plants and animals and material around them in a way that the rest of society was either ignorant to or hostile to, and they used those things to create what was essentially your neighborhood drugstore back before there was a drugstore. And that's cool. I love that.
Yeah, I mean, because what was Dwayne Reed back then? It was your local hedge witch, you know, like
it was that strange fellow who lives at the outside of town because nobody trusts them.
Yeah, too much shine on that guy's buckles on his shoes. So there's definitely something off about him. Must be a witch. But like, yeah, I think that there is a really important place in fantasy for books like this. And I think it's such a cool resource that a lot of people don't really think to look to outside of source books for these games. You know, you have books out there like the Time Life Enchanted World books, which, you know, if you follow anything that we follow, any of the various different Instagrams that we follow, there's always people who are stumbling upon them and selling them. And I highly recommend everyone get them if they can. But, you know, taking your influence from these other books is just going to add such depth to whatever RPG you're playing, because there might be some kind of idea in there that's just going to turn your game on its ear in all the best ways.
Yeah, I mean, this sort of does kind of like RuneQuest feels, because Greg Stafford was interested in shamanism and stuff like that. RuneQuest feels naturally sort of more attuned to this sort of magic. It's interesting to me that how, having read this book, it like grounds magic into something that's more real and like comprehensible for me, while also like opening all of these possibilities for different directions that you could take it. You could use this book to find like magic items that your players have never heard of and have no context for, and build whole adventures around them that will be fantastic and weird and strange and just not what they expect, because it's just outside of the language of established fantasy. That's awesome. I just think that folks should pick this book up and test it out. There's so much cool stuff, and it is just a lovely and informative book on its own.
Well, I am pumped about this book now because it's a book on like witchcraft. You know, I will not let it cross my threshold. However, I will enjoy looking at it in your home.
There you go.
Dude, do you have any final thoughts?
You know, I think that it just popped in my head that the Dolmenwood setting that Gavin Norman is working on for Old School Essentials feels very in tune with this sort of stuff, and I'm just doubly interested in that coming out finally, so that I can see. It's just it has a very folkish vibe to it, and I think that you'd be able to use witch sticking pins in it or spirit bottles, and they would fit right in. Just want to see this stuff in D&D, and I want to see it used not in a fantastical way, and in a way that brings D&D down to its level.
And I want to see it in Stu's house because it's safer there than mine. So before we go home on this episode, our friends over at Exalted Funeral are having an online convention. Now, when you hear this episode, this will be airing on July 4th. This convention is right around the corner. It's an online convention running the 15th through the 17th of July, starting at 12 noon Eastern on the 15th and rocking and rolling all weekend. Exalted Funerals convention is going to be a killer time. They're going to have Q&As, panels, game sessions that are going to be both streamed, and then tables that you can play online with some really cool people from the industry all weekend long. Now, with all of that being said, it's a great opportunity for you to dip your toe in the world of conventions, especially if you haven't been going to conventions lately, or if there's no conventions local to you. Exalted Funeral Convention is going to be where it's at. Because look, you've been spending your money there anyway. Why not get a look behind the curtain? So Exalted Funeral Convention, 15th, 16th, and 17th of July. There'll be more information on their website, and it's definitely worth checking out. So with that being said, it's been another amazing episode of the Vintage RPG Podcast. Stu, where can the people find you online?
They can find me on Instagram at Vintage RPG, where I'm posting stuff about, you know what, maybe I will do a whole like occult spooky week next year. That'd be fun, right?
Yes, because you are already at the tail end of 2023, loading up that Instagram, getting ready to go. You can find me on the Twitter, on the Instagram, and on the TikTok at John McGuire RPG. I post mostly on Instagram. I post a little bit on the Twitter. I'm dipping my toes in the TikTok. If you are interested in 321 action, all of our books are available now over at exaltedfuneral.com. If you like the show, don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe. Your reviews really do help other listeners to find us. And if you love the show, why not become a patron? Patreon.com/vintagerpg. We've got a behind-the-scenes look at Stu's book. What's it called, Stu?
It's called Monsters, Aliens, and Holes in the Ground, a guide to tabletop role-playing games from Dungeons & Dragons to Mothership.
I swear I'm going to write it down one day, but in my head, it's still 10th title experience points. Anywho, you got a behind-the-scenes look at Stu's amazing book, and you have a behind-the-scenes look at 321 Action. You have a killer Discord community that we would love for you to be a part of, and we're starting to run games for the patrons. I've got about a month and a half worth of dates available. If you want to enroll DCC with your old buddy HB, you could sign up through our patron Lounge on the Discord or through the Patreon itself in the post that I've made. We also have early release episodes and some other cool stuff in the works. Patreon.com/vintagerpg. So for Stu Horvath, I'm John Hambone McGuire. May the dice always roll in your favor.
Thanks for listening. Don't forget to like, review, and subscribe to the podcast. Every review helps other listeners to find us. The Vintage RPG Podcast is a ham-fisted production. Music by Dega West. Art by Schaefer Brown. If you like the podcast, you should also consider becoming a patron at patreon.com.